Like to welcome Kurt, who will be our newbie today. And Darren, good morning. And Brian, glad to have you with us again.
Thank you.
And hopefully we'll pick up a couple other people. Kurt, everybody's welcome. Opinion is welcome. We're all pretty amicable, and it's a group, and the number of people each time is sometimes different, but Dave and Darren are basically, I mean, they're here every meeting, so we're kind of the core group, and other people wander in and out. So we hope you'll be with us for a long time and become a core member. Okay. Our first topic today, and the first two topics are kind of related. What has the overall impact or influence of cultural interests in martial arts done for the art, you as a teacher, your school, and your expression of the art? It goes back to the 50s, it was judo, and then the 60s brought karate, and the 70s brought kung fu, and the 80s were all about the ninja, and then there were some books, and now the biggie is, well, first was Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and now it's MMA and Cobra Kai, and in essence, what has happened is that martial arts has become more of a household term rather than something that's, oh, you're in the martial arts. It's kind of like on the same par as football, basketball, whatever else. So the question is, I guess, how has this change influenced you, or how you teach, or how you run your dojo, or do you have, I don't like to use the term kiddie programs. Do you have kiddie programs, after school programs, which is really nothing wrong with them, because some of these places are literally businesses, and they have to, the goal of business is to stay in business and make a profit. And that's what they do to, I guess, make their bread and butter, and then in the evening they can teach real classes. Not to say that kids don't learn things, but it's different. Okay, so what are your thoughts, or how has all this affected how you teach and how you run your classes, or has it had any effect, or what?
I'd like to start.
Go ahead, Darren.
Kind of a way to introduce myself too. Kurt Spearbreaker. I'm in Washington State. It's a little different for me. I'm a federal law enforcement officer. I'm a control tactics use of force instructor for my agency, and I teach on the side some private students. So most of what I teach is for law enforcement, and so that's how I'm influenced, is strictly what works on the job, what doesn't. Case law is huge. It's got to correlate with federal case law, Graham v. Connor. It's objectively reasonable force. Not minimal force, what a lot of people think. It's got to be minimal force, it's got to be reasonable force. So that's how everything I focus, at least for now, and I'm 53, I can retire this year, but I probably won't. And then I plan on opening up a part-time school, and then that will change everything for me. Right now, everything I focus on is it reasonably objective? Can I use it on the street? And then later on, then I want to really dive into what I would consider the essence of martial arts, because then I can do whatever I want at that point. So it definitely has affected me, but probably different than from how it affects other people on the panel.
Okay. And I'm familiar with reasonable force, and it's usually in most cases, at least for civilians, if it ever gets to court of law, that gets determined on the bench. Which is why it's an important factor to consider in teaching your students, because if like me, I teach traditional jujitsu, I also, as my sensei stressed, you have to also be able to use control in what you are doing, because depending on the situation, you may not want to cripple a person permanently, for lack of a better phrase. Nor would the court be happy if you did it, if it went to court. Any other thoughts on how all these, like probably MMA and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu have had the greatest effect on all of us currently? I mean, I remember back in the Kung Fu days when you had a Kung Fu, it was kind of like the rumor used to be, in some towns there was a church on every corner, and then you had Kung Fu dojos on every corner, and then you had, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu dojo on every corner, and now you have MMA dojo on every corner. And
yeah, I'll jump in. I think my approach has stayed very traditional. We kind of talk in the beginning, we go through our warm up. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. Teach a basic technique, and I have them work on it, and that's basically with our mentoring and martial arts program, which is younger people. Now, I will say this: they try to influence it another way. Oh well, how about some Wing Chun moves, or those kinds of things. And what I have found, especially with the younger people, because we're dealing with 13-year-olds and up, and this is something George and I had spoken about 13 years ago, I think, George, believe it or not. I said, what's a good entry point for what we do? And he says 13, he goes, I like 10 and above, but we chose 13. So those 13 to 18-year-olds that we're working with that have one parent homes, typically, they're looking for boundaries. They're looking for guidance, for use of a stronger term, a father figure per se. So it tends to be, I think, very strict compared to the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu classes I've seen, and very controlled is the way we run it. So I've really kind of stuck to the old tenets. I really haven't changed that much in that area. But if I'm teaching adults, and I've done women's self-defense classes and things like that, I'm just trying to keep them safe. So yeah, so that's, but I loved the discussion last week about it's not martial arts, it's partial arts. That's gonna stay with me forever. Because it's I just think it's harder to do. I always start with stance, and I use that as a metaphor. When you take a stance, you're metaphorically, you're taking a stance for yourself. And I go from there. So it really hasn't changed that for me. It would probably look a lot closer to Bill Fromm's class in the 70s versus kind of what I see today. So
Okay. Yeah, I will, having been a school teacher, when I found that if I was teaching a certain way, and it worked, I'd get bored after a couple, 3 years. And the worst thing you can have is a bored sensei. Uh,
Right.
so I tend to change how I teach, or every probably couple, 3 years. Just it's mainly for me, but the older students do tend, that have been around for a while, pick up on it. Um, Techniques are the same. The actual teaching of the techniques is the same. The belt requirements are the same. Uh, you do have to, I think, as an instructor, be sensitive to your, how do you call it? Sensitive to your audience. Because I'm not trying to be too, and I probably said it before, they're your customers. And Brian, as you said, some of them may also be looking for a father figure. And so you're walking particularly with kids, you're walking a very fine line of, my first principal said that if you're going to be a good teacher, you have to be able to walk the fence. And if you're too lenient, the kids will eat you for breakfast. And if you're too strict, the kids will kick you for breakfast. Yeah. 'Cause it was a really tough junior high school, and the kids would eat you for breakfast. But it's you have to be sensitive to the needs of your students. But I've found you can do that in how you communicate with them, but you can still teach the same stuff you taught 20, 30 years ago. It's just, you need students learn better when they see it, when they have a connection with you as an individual person. And sometimes that's hard to tune into, particularly for those of us that are older. Kurt and Darren, Dave, you're still young. But so I mean, it's has Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or MMA affected how you teach, or?
It has for me. It's a huge part. Mixed martial arts, MMA, and Krav Maga are all the great pushes in law enforcement today. And you try to explain something like Taiho Jitsu, or it goes right over their heads. And cops are the worst students in the world. They're all type A. They all think they know something anyway. And so you have to capture their imagination. I have way better it's just a lot easier to teach private students that are not law enforcement. I have a YouTube channel, and the people you see on my channel none of them are cops. Well, for the exception of once in a while, you'll see a fellow coach. But Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I do it myself on the side. I mix it in with more so for the concepts that go along with it, the active resistance and stuff like that. But I still think I fall back on, because I have a Hapkido and Taiho Jitsu background, Kaji Kembo, all that stuff. I still fall back on the traditional stuff quite a bit, because it works, or it wouldn't have been around as long as it has. But yeah, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu especially, my goodness, and MMA. Well, I grew up in the 70s and 80s. My first movie, what got me into martial arts, is my father took me to Chuck Norris Breaker in the theaters, and I just thought that was the greatest thing since sliced bread. I had to be like Chuck Norris. And then in the 80s, like you said in your thing, the ninja stuff, oh my gosh. Luckily I never got caught up into that, but yeah, and then the UFC is where I was getting at. That changed the way everybody looked at martial arts, right, wrong, or indifferent. And so yeah, it seems like BJJ is kind of like that new. Well, it's not new; it's been around for forever now. But yeah, it definitely has a huge influence.
Yeah,
And as you know, it's great to be able to be competent on the ground. Everyone should be competent on the ground, because I don't believe in anti-grappling. You have to be a decent grappler to get back up on your feet. But on the street, you don't want to be on the ground if you don't have to be. It's a little different in law enforcement, because we're always scrapping. We have to take them to the ground to get them in handcuffs. So BJJ is big in my world, but I could see where it needs to have its intelligent limitations when you're incorporating it into a system. And are we incorporating into the system? Jiu-jitsu, in my mind, is jiu-jitsu. Kodokan Judo, all that stuff has been around forever. Everyone thinks it was invented by Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Well, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu came from Judo / Japanese Jiu-Jitsu.
Okay. Yeah, and I don't want to get into, picking on BJJ or MMA or UFC. That's not our goal here. It's just how has it affected how we teach? There is, as I said before, if I'm going to do groundwork with my students, I never tell them ahead of time. If I say next week we're going to, 2/3 of them won't show up. Because unless you do groundwork a lot, it's a whole different ballgame. And but one of the things I think that many people miss, and I've even seen it with some jiu-jitsu sensei who have never done, how do you say, traditional groundwork. I'm not talking about UFC or BJJ, is they say, what do I do on the ground? And I think I brought up last week is that most of the techniques, the joint locks to the extremities, etc., that you do standing up, you can do on the ground. And once the student realizes that, they realize I'm not helpless down here. And some of this stuff isn't quote unquote fair. None of it's fair if you have a technical advantage over your opponent. But I don't, I think groundwork MMA or UFC from traditional jiu-jitsu, I think is different. Because our goal is to get out of that situation, get back up into a standing position or in a controlling position, not, for lack of a better phrase, to wrestle with the person on the ground until one of you gets a pin and the other person taps out. Because that reality doesn't work on the street, at least not in my book and from experiences I've had. So do we want to deal with this topic any longer, or?
So one thing, so in the karate world, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu had kind of, I would say, two effects. One, probably the negative effect of that popularity, like when UFC hit, every karate dojo suddenly was like, we know all about ground fighting. We've always done jiu-jitsu. It's part of it. Like they were trying to, insert that back into karate and kind of, because karate was losing to Brazilian jiu-jitsu everywhere. So now they have these strategies for ground fighting and how to do karate on the ground. And I think that's a mistake, trying to like hop on that bandwagon and say karate is, comparable there. So that really, karate had a rough time for like a decade of trying to get back into that UFC kind of thing. But the good thing about UFC stuff, early, like if you were learning karate in the 50s and the 60s, everything was about karate against a boxer. You would always be thinking, there's like a saying, if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And the way they present karate to you is that these are defenses against unskilled attacks, namely punching. So everything you do in karate, you would respond to somebody throwing a haymaker at you. And in the kata of karate, the responses are recorded, but not the attacks. So when you do these motions and you do these sequences, you don't know what the attack is. So for the first 40 years of karate in America, you assume the attack is somebody trying to punch you in the face. Once you get this Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu stuff in your mind, now you're looking at your kata like, can I use this against somebody trying to choke me, trying to grab me, trying to hug me, trying to grab my waist? Now those techniques in the kata kind of spring to life. And you're like, these aren't just nails all the time. Now maybe there's different attacks that I need to start thinking about. And it gives you a new way to look at your kata, to start thinking, oh, when I'm doing this and spinning around, maybe I'm actually taking somebody's hands, lifting them, getting under them and putting them in an arm bar, not stopping somebody from punching me in the face anymore, you know? So I think that's definitely a thing from the karate angle that has been a good thing from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, opening up the attacks you could see, you know?
I think one of the problems, and I've seen, and I still see it, you know, if someone walks into your dojo and you're doing groundwork, they'll say, oh, you're doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Or if they see you do a throw, oh, you're doing judo. Or if you're blocking, oh, you're doing karate. And people tend to
Pigeonhole.
techniques and occasion, or I'll even have students on occasion, what do you do if this happens? And I'll short technique and say, oh, that's Aikido, or that's, you know, my comeback is always, it's all jujitsu. And it takes a while for, you know, it's easier to pigeonhole things than it is to say, this is where it came from. And I know usually if for each new session, when I'm introducing I'll introduce what jujitsu is. I'll show a judo technique. I'll say, this is judo. I'll do a karate technique. This is karate. This is a wrist lock takedown. This is Aikido. Okay. And you put it all together. You know, once they see all these bits and pieces that they can be put together, then it's kind of like screwing the light bulb in. The same applies when I worked with LAPD. And I was the only martial artist after the Rodney King incident that got involved with their testing program. And what they used to do was, and they may have gone back to it now, what they used to do is they'd say to the cadets, demonstrate for their proficiency, was demonstrate this technique. My position was, to demonstrate a technique doesn't show knowledge. I said, put them in a situation, see what they do, and if they've been taught a series of techniques that they can do, and I think we only taught like 4 or 5, because what the LAB had done was they had done a lot of research over the years. They knew that 80 to 90% of the responses of perpetrators, for lack of better words, you know, this is what they would do 80 to 90% of the time. So that's where they set up their arrest and control physical program. It said, they've been taught all these techniques. If you're going to evaluate a student on their ability to deal successfully on the street, you need to see, it doesn't matter what technique they use, as long as they use it properly to the best of their ability. And for a while, I know at least they switched to that, to more of a situational testing than specific skill testing, because different people can do different techniques better. Well, you know that from your students. And students will use what they can use best, or what they know best.
Sensei, in our classes, I don't view what we do as so much influenced by other forms of self-defense. I've just learned that early on, when I got beyond this whole notion of lesson plans, the routine we fell into is a very high energy pace. When students come in, they're excited. And it starts out with a big smile from me and the words "follow me," and we blow through a bunch of ukemi. And then we do 50 plus stretches. We follow that up with 40 push-ups and 40 walking lunges. They're breathing heavy. And then from there, we break up into groups of 3. You got uki, tori, and an observer, and they rotate among themselves. So the observer is actually acting like a pseudo sensei, saying, here's what I see. They enjoy working together. Some of it's cross-pollination among belt levels. Some of it's people working at the same belt, at the exact same belt level. And that's the biggest chunk of class right there. We generally get to randori toward the end. I don't see any of that as being influenced by other forms of martial arts. It's just what we found works for us. And I know the high energy pace, the high energy level, and the happiness is contagious.
Yeah, I mean, I think your last word gets it. I mean, and happiness. I mean, you want your students to be happy. That's in anything, but I think they get their happiness from success. And if they feel they're successful in what they're doing, which means you've been successful in what you're teaching, or they've been successful in what they're teaching each other, they're going to be happy. And most people like being in a happy environment. So we're going to call your style of jiu-jitsu Happy Brew. I'm not knocking it, you know.
Sensei, that's got to be one of the better compliments I've ever received in my life.
But you know, you know, I think you can teach what you teach. You know, most good sensei, if you're around them long enough, you discover they have a sense of humor. It may be very subtle. Seki had a very subtle sense of humor. Wally J, very much more subtle sense of humor. There is a Hawaiian, I can't think of his name any longer. He was basically what's called a fire hydrant, his build. Fire hydrant's person whose head kind of like goes into their shoulders. It's you know, and he had a phenomenal sense of humor off the mat. On the mat, you did not mess with him. But and it was very dry sense of humor. And students will pick up on your sense of humor if they're being successful in what they're learning, because they'll relax a bit and they'll be, you know, that's part of their getting to know you as a human. But yeah, I think what we're saying is that we continue to teach what we've been taught. And we probably continue to teach it in that way, or we find a better way. As long as you're teaching the same subject matter, it doesn't matter how you teach it. And I think that's once a sensei realizes that, they're set to go. Like Michael Langwich, who's taking over my park program. He teaches differently than I do. That's okay. Ultimately, he gets the same results. And the students are learning to adapt to his sense of humor. So it's, you know, it's, I think what we're saying is that, well, I don't want to knock any martial art, but a lot of these specific martial arts come and go. The traditional ones are called traditional because they tend to stay. And you tend to find them, you're going to find Aikido in karate, you're going to find judo in karate, you're going to find, you know, there is, they each have their place in the other's martial art. And that's,
you know, just thinking about it, we talk a lot about this differences in styles and even like country of origin and things, like the difference between Chinese martial arts versus Japanese even, and all of that. And it kind of just struck me. It's basically like music, where it just doesn't matter what music you're doing, you do music. And music comes and goes. Like there's no R&B right now, there's no Motown right now, but that happened but nothing happened to music. Nothing was taken away from music because there's not big band anymore. You know, that it happened and it influenced things, but the actual core of music was unchanged and never changed. It doesn't matter if you're a country musician or a classical musician, you know, these scale patterns, the notes, the harmony, there's rules to music that exist outside of what music it is that you listen to. You know, it doesn't matter. Everything is music, whether you like it or you don't like it. And nothing ever changes music. It's just different sounding, but it's all music. And it's kind of the same here with martial arts. You look at it like, oh, that's country music, that's classical music, but those musicians are just competent at their instrument and, you know, using the same rules as each other.
Hey, good morning, Dane. I like your music analogy here, so I'm gonna jump in if I will, and I'm not gonna take full credit behind this because I'm looking at what I'm writing down, listening to everyone's comments, and then Sensei comes back and basically reads my notes without even seeing them. So I'm just gonna try to fill in the gaps on some of the stuff, and I think that's through years of instruction and being affiliated with Sensei here. So I think I just picked up on his stuff, and that's where I get all my information from, between him and Sensei Jack. So the credit is his, not mine. I'm just trying to break it down a little bit. The analogy to music is incredible. I like that. And so basically what we're looking at is the influence comes from the parent art, and then everything else follows through. You know, if we look at, you know, everything else behind it, it's just evolution and what we're doing. When we're picking up an audience on who we're trying to instruct or teach and what the specific need is, I mean, those things change. The need changes, the dynamic changes, everything changes about it. So if we're working with kids, and that's different than working with people that are in a sporting environment. If we're working with people that want to participate in a sporting environment, then that's different from self-defense. And if we're working with people for self-defense, then that's different from law enforcement officials. And if we're working with law enforcement officials, then that's different from tactical. So I mean, every one of those things are applicable to what your audience is. I mean, you can't just take one little thing. So when you talk about traditional, that's the one term that I really kind of just started to stay away from in my instruction in today's time, because when you say traditional in today's time, people are turned off about martial arts. They're like, yeah, that doesn't work because you haven't evolved. And that's the furthest from the truth. The truth is we've broken it down into all of these other systems now, and we're giving you what's applicable to your need. We're giving you, if you want to participate in a BJJ environment because it's a sporting event, then we're giving you the ground aspect of what real jiu-jitsu is. It's just a fraction or a piece of what jiu-jitsu is, a very small fraction. That's why they don't have their own terminology. That's why they don't have that. If you listen to them, and this is not a knock, it's just a fact of what's going on in today's time, as we continue to do other systems or create other styles or other events or other, how we're doing practical application in real life, it all goes back to the parent art, Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. That's the term that I like to use, and that's because that's the entire system. And if you understand Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, you'll understand that Japanese Jiu-Jitsu and any other system that you have, whether you call it Judo, whether you call it Aikido or Hapkido or BJJ, etc., they're all going back to the parent art in Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. Have those things evolved? Absolutely, they have. So when you talk about a kata, we do things in randori that become second nature. That's how we learn to train. So you can be able to defend yourself when it's necessary to a scenario-based attack. We practice those things because we want it to be second nature and not have hesitation in response, but be able to defend yourself if that's what the intent is, or be able to perform at a higher level if it's a sport, because that's what the intent is. Then that's the direction of what you're going in. The only difference between any one of those things is when you're in practice, you have to be able to practice things that are defendable. If you're doing something that's not defendable, there is no defendable, then there is no applicable defense for it. Therefore, you have to practice things that are common. So you have scenario-based situations, and then you practice those things to be able to respond and react. Second nature.
Okay. No, good summary, Darren. I think what you're bringing up is important, that we the martial arts can be bits and pieces, but they're all related. They all have the same, ultimately, most of them have the same goals philosophically, notwithstanding the personalities of some individual sensei. Most sensei do not have egos that are, 50 feet tall. Most sensei come across as being very humble people, regardless of martial art. They, you don't assume. I was at the vet the other day, and it turns out the lady who was working behind the counter used to be a Taekwondo instructor. She says, I'm too old and too fat now to do it. And she says, and then she asked me for my email address, and she says, "You're a sensei?" Yeah. you're, and if someone were to just look at you, because, how do you say, we have a certain level of self-confidence, not being overconfident, we have a certain level of self-confidence. We tend not to be out there in front, pushing ourselves, or not want to say, putting ourselves out front, saying, "Look at me, look at me, look at me. I'm wonderful." And we tend to, I think most martial arts instructors tend to let people discover them rather than the other way around.
I think there's I never thought of this term before, but it just clicked when you said that. Like, I think the martial arts I think kind of the point of it is like a reluctant excellence. Like, you want to be able to defend yourself, and you want to never, ever be in a situation where you have to defend yourself.
Right.
Like, you want to be able to rise to any occasion, and you hope never does an occasion happen.
Right. Hey, that's how I say it. Almost any situation creates it, whether it be, two countries that are competing with each other, teachers versus students, customer versus salesperson. You do have this, if a salesperson comes at you full bore, you're going to walk out the door of their business. Well, I was going to say something else, but it's now lost in the vast gray expanse between my ears somewhere. But anyway, so let's go on to the next topic. And these are still Dane's topics, I believe, from way back when. No.
Yeah, I haven't had to make any new ones for a while.
No, we haven't. We're going to, we're down to only 13 topics left, actually 12 now. Okay, the next one is, and let's be a little philosophical here, and I don't know if anyone can answer this or whether we've dealt with it already in this part of the discussion. What should teaching martial arts 100 years from now look like? If you had your druthers, if you had your way, what would it look like?
I'm not sure there's an answer at the moment.
Okay, I can accept that.
Nope, knowing me, it would be the same. So, yeah, it would look exactly the way it looks today.
Yeah, okay, it's kind of hard to project ahead 100 years from now.
Yeah.
I guess I would hope that it still looks a lot alike and it hasn't lost its essence. We like to say back in the 70s and 80s, you look at some of the old sparring and very different from now, but also our world is different now as far as what is acceptable everybody gets lawsuits and gets sued real easy. So, back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, when people were sparring without gloves, or, it wasn't uncommon for me to come home from my class when I was in high school with a bloody nose, because it happens. And nowadays, or it seems to, in some cases, being watered down. And I hope, and then on the other side of the spectrum, it's not watered down. It's like you got like this split where some people are really trying to push to keep it authentic. And I don't think authentic means it has to be hard on your body or hard on, I just hope that in 100 years, we still have what we would call martial arts. That's what would scare me, is that it just disappears.
I don't know that it disappears. I think it continues to evolve. And if you look back in time or throughout time, you'll see how as brutal as some of the training that what martial arts used to be, it has been, I guess, watered down a little bit in some regard. But then you find pockets of where the training is still very intense, depending on the level of experience of who's actually leading those classes, or the practitioners that are participating in it. And if you look at now, at those levels, the ones that are doing it, and I'm not talking about combat sports, I'm just talking about training in general. If you look at in the past, you can look at some videos or some footage of people training where it was very intense in past time. Now, the people that are training at that level of intensity are much more dynamic. So the evolution is there 100%. There's no one that could deny that. So I think that as time goes along, it will continue to evolve, and then you'll continue to have people that take away from it, but you'll also have some of the ones that continue to maintain focus on the applications of it being what's necessary for it to be used as, to be applicable, to be successful for the scenario that's in front of them.
Darren, I agree with you completely. It's definitely going to continue to evolve. I mean, evolution we see just year to year, decade to decade, in our own teaching and observing. I agree with you completely, Darren. One thing we could do is look back 100 years, and we have video from the 1930s of people defending themselves using Japanese jiu-jitsu style techniques, and using them very effectively. It's kind of funny to watch because the men are wearing Superman kind of outfits that look kind of weird. They wouldn't pass at all today. And the women that are defending themselves have this kind of cocky, arrogant look on their face. But you can go back online and see videos from the 1930s, not quite 100 years ago. And yes, we've got new techniques that have evolved, like Darren says. However, we most of what vast majority of what you see, you can sit there and identify. This is a variation on a Nudegarumu Shiro. This is a Teinagi. This is the techniques are there.
Yeah, I don't know that. I mean, through the time in history, there's so many things that we've created as a technique, or not we. I mean, time has created in the arts. I don't know that there is any more that we can create, but there's different ways of applying them, right? And there's different speeds, there's different strengths, there's different sizes of people, big, small, faster, stronger, whatever. And so that continues to evolve, but the technique, the foundation of the technique is the same. I mean, the anatomy can only do so much.
Yeah.
Like I agree. It's my body type is different than Dave's, and different from everybody else's in here. So that's the art aspect to me. You might have one technique that you do very, very well that you practice all the time. I just, for me, there's a core to all of this, and you've got to master the core before you can start going in different directions. And without that core, it's like a car without tires. Like, what does that look like? Kind of thing to me. So That's where I'm coming from. And that's why I say traditional. I think you've got to do the traditional basic stuff, and then, you know, as you get better and you've learned about your own body, then you can start moving in other directions.
Yeah, Brian, I think that concept comes into sporting environments, especially. You know, you take a world champion judoka, if you will, right? And they, as many techniques as there is out there that they can perform, they focus on just a handful.
Yep.
And they get extremely good at those 5 techniques, because that's where you're not going to be able to stop them, and they become world champions. But I think it's the same concept of what you're saying in developing your foundation.
I think you nailed it. Talking about judo is a great example of how much it's changed just from when it became an Olympic sport. Things that are allowed versus what wasn't allowed or was allowed back in the day. It's changed so much, not for the worst, it's just different. And rule set changes everything about whatever martial art. Old school Taekwondo versus modern Olympic Taekwondo. You look at the two side by side and it almost doesn't look the same anymore.
That's correct. Yeah.
I think that's a good point too. The judo thing, I think we might see a lot more of that, where there's like judo is now distinct from jujitsu, even though they're the same. But what makes them different is that the kind of rules, like you were saying, like the intention behind it and things, like it's made to be competitive against other judoka, not a defense against anyone whatsoever kind of a thing. So it starts branching differently. And I think, like we were saying too, like Darren was saying earlier, where there's all these different, you know, who are you? What are you getting from it? Are you a military guy? Are you a police officer? Are you a hobbyist? Are you just trying to get in shape? Each of those kind of becomes a different martial art. If each of those students then go open a school, now you have a school that teaches cardio kickboxing. Now you have a school that teaches self-defense. Now you have a school that teaches military combat, and they're all the same art, but they're all entirely different, and different students, different mindset, different techniques will get emphasized. And if you look at karate, like you were saying, 100 years ago, and then like 100 years before that, what's happened? Well, 200 years ago with karate, it was taught in complete secrecy, and all you were taught was the kata, and you had to learn what they meant to yourself, and that was it. 100 years after that, the kids that were learning it wanted to spar with each other. So they started punching and kicking each other. And the original masters were like, please don't do that. That is not karate. Karate is only kata. Don't do this sparring thing. You're going to ruin everything. And everybody takes that to mean like they were just being cautious and that karate was too dangerous at the time and you shouldn't be trying to use it against each other. But I think the actual fact of the matter is that is not what the kata was teaching. So if you start sparring each other, now you're looking at the kata like the kata is for sparring each other. And that's why karate people today don't really know what the kata is. And then they don't like the kata because when they do the sparring, they then say, well, the kata doesn't help me spar. I just need to spar more to get good at sparring. So now you have this emphasis on that kind of karate where you got 2 karate guys kicking and punching each other. So now, though, that is karate. And now you do need to defend against people who are going to come up to you and try to kick you. But you never used to because that wasn't what you did. Now it is what people do. So that karate of 100 years after, now you do have to practice punching and kicking and defending against that because people think that is something. Then 100 years from that, we've got all this stuff. It could be cardio kickboxing. It can just be sparring. You know, it can be, you know, the MMA kind of angle. So I don't know if 100 years from now, it'll get split more where there's like a judo, where there's a karate that's intended just to be people punching and kicking each other, a karate that's intended to be the original philosophical thing, a karate that, you know, I don't know if those will become their own standalone thing the way judo and jujitsu did, or if it'll all come back together again and go back to like the original form where you pull it all back together and you say, look, stop running off doing all these different things. Like none of those are right, you know? So I don't know if it's going to branch out more or come back together.
I think there's 3 definitive phases, right? You have your reality, That's one, right? You have your law enforcement. That's two, because you can only do certain things, right? Like, or you can be held behind some sort of liability. And then you have your sporting. And that's even to the brutal sports that are out there, even if they're brutal. If you have MMA, that's a brutal sport, but it's still subject to, and if you apply all of those things, anything that is applicable to having rules, then that's a sport, period. The rest is something else. So
Darren, I so agree with that. You took the words right out of my mouth. You've got sport, and then you've got practical application of self-defense. We can call it self-defense. I know there's obviously, but I love that. I think that sums it up. We can talk about, it's like, you know, Taekwondo, sport. The guys that are in Taekwondo will tell you that it's a sport, you know. Everybody in Jiu-Jitsu that's teaching Jiu-Jitsu, I know exactly what, you know, I'm going after. I want someone to be able to defend themselves effectively, you know, and by the way, there are no rules. So you delineate between rules and no rules for me. Sorry, you know, that kind of thing. So
I think
with sports, you're going to have a whole lot more rule changes. Look at the NFL. Look at the 3-point line in basketball. Look at the change in equipment, and on and on. So you much more likely to have literally annual changes in the rules, which change the tenor of the sport. With the self-defense, it works or it doesn't. So those kinds of changes would be perhaps influenced more from society's perception. That is to say, you know, once you had the no holds barred fighting, which grew into the UFC under the auspices of the Boxing Commission. And the rules in the first, if you got videos, I've got videos of the first 50 UFCs. If you watch the first several, you see elbows to the head repeatedly. That stopped because it was human cockfighting, and people were they were suffering permanent injury from their combat. So because UFC is a sport, not taking anything away from it, it has the rules, and those rules will continue to evolve.
Now, with all of those entities, the most significant challenge is for law enforcement officials. I mean, their life is on the line, but they're limited to what they can use in an effort to be able to preserve their own safety, right? And so the rest of it is fair game. I mean, in sport, you understand the rules and they're applicable, or you're penalized and then something stops, right? In self-defense, there are no rules, there are no limitations.
Yeah, and to touch on that, for law enforcement, for example, I can pull something from my own recent experience. This last summer, this guy tried to disarm me, and it was jujitsu or what I call jujitsu, Taiho Jitsu, Hapkido. To me, a rose by any other name is still a rose, right? My first response, because he had been pinned up against a fence rail, or I'm sorry, staircase rail. He was trying to disarm me. My first response was I gouge his eyes out because he's trying to disarm me. It was an objectively reasonable force to gouge his eyes out. But because of my training, I was able to get out of my lizard brain and say, yeah, but there's a Kimura, bent arm shoulder lock right here, and I won't have to do that. And I was able to get into a Kimura and get him off of me, and then get him in, situation cured, problem solved, nobody died. Using vascular strain as an example, and with my department, it has to be life and death situation. You all know as jiu-jitsu men that a vascular restraint or a rear naked choke or a choke, any kind of choke, doesn't matter, you know, using a gi or whatever, is probably the safest way to take somebody out of the equation, because you're all well-trained jiu-jitsu practitioners. You know, like, yeah, I'm just going to choke him because he'll be fine. I'll be fine. Everybody walks away. So it's interesting how the rule set can change how you approach things. Like when I'm doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I do that like twice a week. I still practice all my vascular restraints because when the poo-poo hits the oscillating device, I want to be able to have that tool in my tool bag. But it's funny, I've even had people comment, like when I'm rolling, I'll have somebody's back and I'll immediately try to transition to like a full Nelson or a arm bar or something, like, well, you had a choke available to you. I was like, yeah, but I want options, and the rule set changes everything. Either rules by the law or by, your local laws, or, sport, the rules of that particular organization.
Kurt, you're right. I actually said that session before last is the most humane way to be able to defend yourself as a law enforcement official is using one of those carotid restraints. Out in the field, the biggest problem, I'll say it again, is just the education behind it. Most people don't understand how to effectively use it, and then when it's appropriate to be able to release that technique, because then it becomes detrimental.
Absolutely. The biggest problem in law enforcement today is the lack of training.
Yes.
If every cop trained jujitsu, you'd see a lot less CNN.
Yes.
They'd have to find something else to complain about.
I think, let me throw a few words in here. First, regardless of martial art, there are only so many ways you can move the human body. And those commonalities show up, whether it's the Japanese martial art or Chinese martial art or Middle East martial art or indigenous American population martial art. The human body, as Brian said way back when, can only move in certain directions. Joints only move in certain ways. There are only certain things you can do to the human body, and those are commonalities. So you come up with techniques that, even though they may be called different things and may be applied slightly differently or used in different situations, there are common techniques that are used to deal with the commonalities of the human body, regardless of what we call it or how we practice it. I think, as Kurt said, no, I forgot what it's a word phrase that he used. So those commonalities exist, and I think regardless of what martial art you teach, I think 100 years from now, the core martial arts, traditional martial arts, will still be around, and I think we'll probably still be teaching in the same way. I don't know what I don't know what the sports will be like. I'm sure they're going to continue to evolve. The other thing I think is the when I first started teaching, being in jiu-jitsu, if you had a club swung at you, it was a wooden club, and you kind of swung it slowly. Okay. I think the most extreme change you can find from karate, where all this protective gear has been created so that the katas can be applied to a sparring situation and no one really gets hurt. I know with already, and I've said this before, one of the biggest changes we found was one day I had, many decades ago, a student came. We were using a rubber club, a wooden club wrapped in foam, wrapped in duct tape, so you could swing a little faster. And then one day a student walked in with a golf club tube cut in half. And he says, "Sensei, you can swing full force with this." And so that's what we started doing. Golf club tubes, like 50 cents a piece. And some of those golf club tubes from 20 years ago are still in the dojo. Those suckers last forever. But it changed. It helped make club attacks far more realistic, because now we weren't concerned about actually hurting the person. You can hit your partner in the head full bore with a golf club tube, and all it's going to make is a loud, embarrassing popping sound. Okay. But
so will the wooden club.
Okay, yeah. What's happened is I think if we find things that are more realistic to help us teach more effectively, we will use them. And that's particularly true, I think, in traditional or the core martial arts, because we know it's not going to change the technique. It just makes it we're able to teach our students better so they can execute techniques more effectively. Okay. If you've got a club coming at you full bore, you know what that is going to feel like when you block the person's forearm. Okay. Especially if you're not wearing any padding. Okay. You're wearing foam padding, rubber padding, cloth padding. Seki used to expect that those of us who were brown belts and up, we would be wearing forearm padding, back of fist padding, shin padding, top of the foot padding. Were you wearing a cup? Everybody was expected to wear a cup. He walked around with a hand bow. On occasion, line all the males up and he'd do a little tap. And if you weren't wearing a cup, you had a learning experience. I mean, you can't do that today as a sensei, but so maybe that's an evolution in training students from the 60s. Okay, 60 years ago, you could get away with that legally. And that's one thing that Kurt brought up, is that, and I think Kurt and maybe Brian, society has changed, and what is socially acceptable then is different from now. And that brings up the other thing I want to mention, is that we as jujitsu sensei, if we're teaching techniques that, involve joint dislocations, fractures, injury, we need to be upfront with our students as to what those techniques do. Okay. Because and that goes along with on the street, if you're defending yourself, you're not waiting for a tap out or your opponent to say mate. And if you've trained your students well, they're not going to react to the words ouch, don't, please, all these other words to get the person to stop doing the technique. They're trained, I hate to say, you're trained like Pavlov's dogs. The only two things you react to are tapping, in class, are tapping out and mate. You don't react to any other words. And I mean, students will chuckle at that, but if they know who Pavlov's dogs were, they understand the concept. Is there anyone here who doesn't know who Pavlov's dogs were? And they're ringing the bell. Okay, it was a Russian scientist. He did a preconditioning, preconditioning. He would train dogs. First, he ring a bell, and they would, they'd get food, but if they didn't get food right away, they'd start salivating. And he eventually found he could just ring the bell, the dogs would start salivating. That was their automatic response. And that's one thing you want to get your students away from. The other thing that Kurt brought up, which is really important, is that when you were against that stair rail and you thought, well, I can gouge the guys out, but that's kind of serious. You then saw that elbow sticking out. And he said, oh, I can do a shoulder lock from there. I'm not going to call it a Kimura because that's not a common term for me. That comes from UFC or wherever. But the point is, you saw an extremity out there that could be maneuvered into a legitimate hold or lock or what have you. Okay. And that's an important element that has to be taught in any martial art as well. It is usually in jujitsu and probably Hapkido too, is that if you see it part of the person's body in a certain position or it's available, and say, oh, I can use this and this is what I can do. Okay. And that is a skill that is so important, particularly for law enforcement, where you are restrained from all the other stuff you can do. I mean, I've seen some videos of police officers and that would just shake my head. how much are they going to be, how much is that agency going to be sued for what this officer did? Okay. And it's our awareness, being able to keep our brain cells working, so to speak, to pick up on this stuff, to pick up on what position is your opponent or attacker in. What can you do from that position, rather than saying, I'm stuck doing this technique.
Plus the options, I think, is super
Yeah,
important.
what are your options? And that takes training, with lack of a better phrase, that takes situational training. Because that's not a matter of teaching techniques. Okay. So I think what we're looking at is that if there are core techniques taught across the martial arts, our responsibility as sensei is to not only teach the art, have students aware of what their techniques can do, because I found in many situations, students that have been in street situations are surprised that the technique worked, whatever they did. And secondly, they're also somewhat upset with themselves with the fact that they injured another human being. And we as sensei have a responsibility to help and this is important for law enforcement too, is, even though you have some type A personalities there, is they need to know ahead of time, if they do what the technique correctly, here's what's going to happen. Okay, because here's what's going to happen not only gives you a choice as to how far you're going to carry out that technique, but what are the potential legal liabilities if you do that, if you finish that technique. Okay. And that varies to some extent from state to state, from agency to agency, from situation to situation, from state law to state law. I mean, California reasonable force is far different from some states that have stand your ground laws. And, and then there are other countries. So Aries, may be in an entirely different situation than I am here in California. Where, people have asked me, I said, if a person's in my house, can I shoot them if they're going out of my house because I have a gun? And my response is, make sure you don't shoot them in the back. Because in California, you will probably be legally liable if you shoot them in the back. Whereas if you can get them to turn and you shoot them in the front, you can say, assuming they don't survive and there are no other witnesses, you can say, he was coming towards me to attack me. So particularly if he had a weapon in his hand. So these are all, that's more situational than anything else. But laws are different, and policies are different, and pure self-defense is different. And we have to learn to live with it. Okay. And some of if you're, like Dane brought up, if you are just teaching kata, okay, whether it be karate or aikido or judo or what have you, if I just teach a hip throw for a person that's grabbing my lapel, to me, that's a useless technique. If they can't learn how to also block a hit, or the person's choking them to get a release, there are these, what do you call, distraction, we call them distraction things you need to do so that you can get to the hip throw if that's what you're going to use. Okay. And that's that's the self-defense part of any technique. Techniques themselves are, sweet, innocent, pure. If the uke knows how to fall, he's not going to get hurt. Okay, he knows what to do, or she knows what to do. How do we get this far distracted from the original technique, the original question? What should teaching martial arts 100 years from now look like? I'm just going to say core martial arts will probably be the same. Who knows what else is going to come up as far as sports are concerned in 100 years? And I'm sure the sports that exist now the rules will change in 100 years. I know that when we had jiu-jitsu tournaments, when Seki had jiu-jitsu tournaments, in the 60s, the only thing you couldn't do was no attacks to the face. Everything else was fair game. There's no requirement for protective gear. If the person didn't tap out, they got injured, and if you got hurt in jiu-jitsu, that was your tough luck for being stupid enough to get into a martial art. When we started doing freestyle kata tournaments, we originally had a long list of what you could. We cut the rules down to one page, one side of one piece of paper. And we said, we've got to keep it simple for the competitors. And those rules held up fairly well. Because the more rules you have, the more difficult it is in anything, the more difficult it is to succeed. So but I think if we had those competitions again today, I think someone would sit down and we would probably have some modification to those rules as well. Because we had two techniques that were not allowed. And this was only because of how do you say it? I don't want to say stupidity of the ukes or the ignorance or unwillingness of the ukes to move their bodies appropriately to avoid injury. I think one of the ones we have is that if you took the person down backwards with their arm in an arm lock, you had to physically move their arm out. And then you could continue to take them down from behind, because what was happening was that you could let go of the arm that was their arm, which was behind their back, and they would continue to leave it there. And then their elbow would hit the mat, which would cause a shoulder injury. So, and that became so common simply because the uke wouldn't move his arm out on his own, which a trained martial artist should do. But anyway, okay, we're into this last one, which in a society that wants everyone to have a trophy, will Kyudan and belts still be relevant? I think this is a simple topic. We can deal with it fairly fast. Do you think belts and Kyudan rankings will become irrelevant, or how does everybody gets a trophy? Do you get a belt? Because I had this issue with one of my students a few months ago. He felt he had been in class longer than two other people that got promotions, and he was upset with me that I hadn't promoted him. Should length be a sole criteria for, should there be any, I was going to say, should length of time in class be a sole criteria for promotion, or should anything be a sole criteria for promotion?
Results.
Exactly.
Results should be
I
the
don't know that
criteria.
there should be a sole criteria. There should be minimal requirements to be eligible to move to the next level, showing your commitment to what you're doing, your effort to continue to develop. But once you meet the minimal requirements, then each individual is different. I may be slower to get to a certain level than what Dane may be. He may be able to perform at a higher level, quicker, faster. Maybe it's moving from one rank to the next. And then maybe at some point in time, I'm a little quicker than he is moving to the next level. But in any regard, we should have a foundation of a minimal time requirement that makes you eligible at a certain point to say, okay, Darren, you've been here for the minimal time requirement, but you're still not meeting the minimal requirements in development. Dane, you've been here for the minimal time requirement, but you're surpassing the expectation to be able to move to the next level. Therefore, you're eligible for promotion. And I think as Americans in today's society, there needs to be some sort of goals to where it holds their, people's attention to be able to say, okay, I'm advancing. And one of the things that I like to do that has satisfied the need in my teaching is on both sides of the fence, whether they're performing to meet not only the minimal requirements, but in development or lacking of, is I always tell anyone that starts to come into my classes, if you want to see your own progress, video yourself now, and then we could watch it together in 3 months, and we can talk about your development or lack of it. It's undeniable.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To have something to show them.
I've been teaching for, I'm getting into my 57th year of teaching. I like that.
Yeah. There was
It's
just
undeniable.
there was just a girl recently that got fired from her job for doing a poor job at her job, and she videotaped it and released it on the internet to get sympathy about that. Like, can you believe they did this? How outrageous? How could they fire me? And it's very much like, you are not performing well. You're not doing what you need to be doing here. So we're going to let you go. But she's outraged, and there's a community around her of outrage about that. Whereas I'm guessing everyone here would be like, well, that sounds like you should get fired. When HR calls you and says you're doing a terrible job, you usually get fired. And she's outraged, and that's an injustice, and that can't be. And that's where I think it's going to be. They disagree when you say you should be able to throw somebody when you need to get the next belt. They'll look at that like, well, then you need to get rid of that requirement so that I can get the next belt. Like, there was a girl famously that couldn't make it into a cheerleading team, so they removed the requirements to get into the cheerleading team so she could join. Like, she couldn't do the requirements, so they waived the requirements so she could be a cheerleader. But then you're never actually a cheerleader because you're not doing the things the other cheerleaders do. So that's where I'm very concerned about that new generation coming in and how they're going to receive that feedback. That's why I love the video thing. You can show them, like, here you are not doing it. Here's what it should look like, and here's what you're doing.
I think what this does is bring up the issue of, which I think is one of Dane's questions still, in a society that wants everyone to have a trophy. If you look at a lot of kiddie sports, there are tons of trophies for participant.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, oh, you're breathing, you get a trophy.
For showing up.
Pardon?
For showing up, here's your trophy.
It is showing up. I've had teachers, school teachers say, you're coming in here with a C. You can either work up or down. I mean, I never use that approach.
Maybe that's a solution. Maybe you're a yellow belt, but you're a C, and maybe this other person's a yellow belt, but they're an A.
Right. That's why they're moving
got
up.
an A in yellow belt, and you got a C in yellow belt, but you're both wearing yellow. I don't know.
And using Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as an example, you could have a young athletic purple belt who competes every weekend. He goes 5-6 days a week, and he can destroy a black belt on the mat, but that black belt is a hobbyist. He's 20 years older, and he's just doing it for fun and athleticism. And of course, the purple belt can destroy him, but that doesn't make one less than the other. And a good example is Elio Gracie said that to get a Gracie Jiu-Jitsu blue belt, you had to be able to defend yourself against a bigger, stronger, more athletic street thug. And now you see, because I do jiu-jitsu as well, you'll see a very different standard for a jiu-jitsu blue belt. It's jiu-jitsu against jiu-jitsu. So a belt can mean so many things depending on how you do your art and why you do your art. And then you'll see no-gi schools that don't even use belt systems. They use belt system and like in 10th Planet Jiu-Jitsu, but nobody actually wears the belt. Everybody looks around the mat and they know who the really good practitioners are, and the belt had nothing to do with it. It's hard to reflect that in your training to this generation. And I'm a field training officer in law enforcement, so I've seen a huge transition in how my students learn Gen Z versus my older officers. And I'm dyslexic, so I know that there's multiple ways to teach an adult student. And so you have to be able to be flexible yourself in how you project the knowledge.
Right. I think, I mean, when I test students, I test them on their skill level with certain techniques, their attitude, yada, yada, yada. That gets them a certain belt rank. But if I look at them in terms of self-defense, a lot of it has to do with their ability to respond to, I look at self-defense, your ability to respond to an unknown situation. And I've had green belts that do a better job of a quick response compared to purple and brown belts sometimes. They may not have the technical knowledge down to do the technique as well as a brown belt. But if a person moves into them with an attack, they get themselves tuned in fast enough where they can do something to initiate a good self-defense technique. And to me, that's an entirely different skill. And, you know, so it's, and sometimes students surprise you. They, you know, they'll use, I'll teach a particular technique and I'll say, or I'll say, do something for a roundhouse. And they'll come up with a technique sequence that I haven't seen before. And the whole class will turn out and applaud them because it's just something you didn't expect. They responded well. They did a good execution of the technique. And it was good quality. And that's what I'm after as far as student proficiency is concerned. But that's different from giving
when you're looking at that, Sensei, when you're looking at those factors, when you're having someone that is performing physically, that understands how to respond or react to something, but they don't have the years and experience, they don't have the minimal eligibility and time requirements, the understanding, the commitment, the contributions, the mental development. Does that mean that we promote them to black belt? In my opinion, I say no. I mean, just because someone is physically gifted doesn't mean that they've met all of the other requirements to be able to move into the next level. They still have these minimal foundational expectations to be able to begin to move into the next level. So I've seen in BJJ at times where you can have someone that is physically talented that goes into a competition and they won a competition at a certain level, and then all of a sudden they're being promoted to like a blue belt or a purple belt or whatever. And but when they go into having to defend themselves in a real life scenario, they don't know anything else just because they were in a sporting event and they were successful in a sporting event because they were faster, bigger, stronger at a different, they still don't have all of the understanding of what they're needing to be able to move to the next level, and certainly not the contribution or the commitment or the mental development that comes along with it.
Okay. And that to me, to pick up all this, what some people may call peripheral stuff, is the responsibility of the sensei to help the student develop that awareness so that you have, because ultimately our goal is to develop, I hope, well-rounded black belts who ideally will go out start their own dojo. I'm 57 years later, I'm still that idealistic.
Sensei, I'll add this. This is a very
Yeah.
visual thing. In combat sports, you can have world champions, and I believe I've said this during another session as well. You can have world champions, and as proud as they are as these world champions, UFC included, you've seen it all the time. They win a world championship, and they're holding the pinnacle of what their goals are, to have a world championship. They're holding the belt in their hands. But it's not nearly as emotional the time that they win one of those belts. And then their sensei, their coach, their mentor comes in and says, you are now awarded this black belt. And then emotionally, they're devastated. They crumble to the emotional value that gives to them. Like before that, they're holding the world championship up like this, proud and strong, and like, I'm the world champion. But when they're handed a black belt by that individual that truly means something to them, they're emotionally overwhelmed. And that's the testament to what we're saying. When you earn a black belt, it should be felt that you truly earned that level of expertise.
Right. And you have a certain skill level, you have a certain knowledge level, you have a certain, I'd say you've developed a, I don't want to say a personality, but you've taken in a lot of information and you've formed it into something that works for you, that your sensei is proud of you and what you have accomplished. It's like a parent-child thing, or graduating from high school or graduating from college. And your parents are really proud of you, and you realize, because you go to college, you learn some skills, but you should learn a bunch of other stuff too. And it should help make you a much better, well-rounded person. And your parents are proud of that. But it's your recognition that they are proud of you for what you have accomplished that makes the impact to you. Okay. And that's I think is what we as sensei ideally are after as well. And we can go back to the beginning, I think when Dave mentioned the parent-child relationship. Was that you that mentioned it earlier on in this discussion?
I've mentioned it before, but not in this.
Or maybe it was Brian. I don't. Was it Brian?
It was the
It's
subject.
probably me.
It was a topic one Sunday.
Well, I know there's a
one
third
Saturday.
topic way back when, but we mentioned it briefly today as well. It's that relationship that you've established with the student that has come to, for lack of a better phrase, full fruition. And that as sensei or as parents, I think is what or boss of a company with our employees, that's what we're really after, because that makes everyone look good.
Sensei, that said, all black belts are not created equal.
No.
And if you want to draw an analogy to other art forms, if you're a black belt in piano, you're a level 4. There are 8 levels in piano. And you've got the dawn grades of level 5, 6, 7, and 8 in piano. And none of those are equal, because you have the concept of virtuosity, but you also have the concept of versatility. Some black belts are a lot more versatile than others, making them less predictable. And that's just the nature of any art form. Whether it's, graphic arts, sculpture, music, self-defense. It is a milestone. It is a goal. It is worthwhile. It's an incredibly rich experience. And Darren's certainly right. It's very, very emotional. It's a day you never forget. And yet, it is just like a level 4 pianist. You know enough to really be effective, and you know enough to really enjoy the instrument at level 4. But if you can get 5, 6, 7, and 8, every one of those, you enjoy it that much higher, that much better, that much more fully, that much more richly. Some of what I enjoy about this Zoom meeting is getting the richness of Darren Mellerine's experience, Dane Varello's experience, Sensei Kirby's experience. Brian, I've really enjoyed what you brought to the table. And Kurt, it's great to meet you today, and I've really gained a lot from what you've shared. You know, this continues to enrich all of us and make us better black belts.
Yeah, I'd like to add that, you know, one of the things, probably the biggest thing I'm involved in is the mentoring program. Our kids can't test for a belt until they achieve a life goal. That life goal could be you're getting D's. David, darn it, you're getting D's in English. You bring me a B, you can test for your yellow belt. And not until then. So it's the carrot and the stick, but we told them at the very beginning, we won't ask you to test unless we think you're ready. There's no timeline per se, because some kids can get there twice a week and some kids could, to your point earlier, Darren. So, and we have a third thing, which is also community. Have you done service to the community? So, the martial arts is the part of it, but that's a delineation. And by the way, you want to go after purple? What's your life goal? One guy, he was able to document that he fixed his grandmother's fence. So I'm just kind of going back to the whole trophy discussion there, but yeah, that's just something that they know that they've got to do just more than be a martial artist and be competent at that. And they also know when they're invited that they're ready. And that way we don't get any of these discussions about, well, they've been there as long as I have. That seems to have delineated that sensei. So
I think Brian, you bring up a really important point. Is that we as sensei, part of our responsibility is to help our students become more well-rounded people. And again, that's a parental goal. That's, we want to see them, we want to see them succeed, but part of that success is them being self-motivated to succeed. I've seen it somewhat in jiu-jitsu. I know at taught junior high, I'd occasionally have students say, teachers come to me and say, so-and-so is getting a D in my class. What can you do to get him up to a C or a B? Or I'd say, your next promotion for, so-and-so, I'd talk to the student, say, this is a situation. You want that next promotion? Bring your grade up in that class. And I'd ask them, is there a reason why you can't get up to that grade? They said, no, I just haven't put the effort into it. And students will really be honest with you if they trust you. And I'd say, well, put the effort into it. I said, I'm not really going to keep you from getting a promotion regardless of whatever grade you get in Mr. C's class. But if you can do it, do it. It'll make someone else happy. All of this is part of our responsibility as sensei. It's not just teaching techniques or awarding belts, because we're dealing with human beings and we want them all to become better people. And getting promotions is part of that better people, and it's not a participation trophy.
And Darren and Dave really both hit the topic in a way that made it a little more clear for me too. And like Darren was saying, it's very important to separate the trophy and the belt. They mean very, very different things, even though I think a student conflates it and makes it one thing. Like your belt is a trophy to them, but it isn't to us. And like Dave is saying with the piano, like when you get to that point where you're a black belt in the piano, that might look different. you might be like a ragtime pianist or a classical pianist or a jazz pianist at that level, but it means something about where you are on your piano path. Like you're a certain level of competency, but it might sound different. You might play differently, but you play at a level. And it's kind of the same with martial arts or really anything. That belt is a recognition of where you are on your path, not where you are on like my path. It's not that you got to where I got or anything. It's that you got where you need to be to that next point. Your view might be different than mine was, but I recognize that you're there. So here, your black belt is different than mine or anyone else's, but you are a black belt. It just looks different. But when you get a trophy, I was always taught in the martial arts that when you get defeated or somebody beats you up or whatever you want to say, they're not excellent, you're terrible. You did a bad job that somebody else beat you. Not they're just so much better and there was nothing you could do. There's things you could do and you did it poorly. You performed poorly. That's why you lost. So really a trophy is telling you that other people were worse than you, not that you're better than anyone. So a trophy is kind of just saying of all the people there, everyone else was worse at it than you are. And you might go somewhere else where that's not the case. Like when you look at the very first UFC, Hoist Gracie is deeply impressive, but he's also going up against people who have never left their dojo and they're like ninja and things. They've been training in like ninja fighting in a dojo where they do like somersaults and throw rubber ninja stars. And now they're in this thing where the guy's punching them in the face for real. Like, was Hoist Gracie really phenomenal in that first one, or is everybody really terrible in that first one? So that trophy doesn't mean as much to me. The later UFCs, the one where Hoist Gracie lost to people who knew what they were doing, that's a different UFC, right? So what's his trophy mean there? And yeah, so just that separation of those became clear to me, thanks to Dave and Darren here. To Dave's point about the beauty of this conversation, this is where there's a mental learning you have to do too. This is how we can continue to train. It's not just techniques, right?
Okay.
I think it's important to see that it's also perspective on what a black belt is. Like you go to Japan and who's a black belt in judo? Well, probably every other person on the street, but because they have it in the school systems there. But like every judo black belt is definitely not created equal. And just let people understand that your journey is going to be different than the guy that's trying to become the next MMA champion. It's to have that realistic concept. And from all the movies and everything, society, I think, has put a black belt on such a high pedestal. In reality, it's step one to now you can actually know the basics. Now you can get to really learning,
Yeah, black belt is
In
intermediate.
addition, sorry, Dave.
That's okay. I'm just going to make the point that black belt is intermediate. It's society views it as advanced.
Yeah.
But you very quickly learn once you hold one how intermediate you are, and how far you have to go to become advanced.
In addition to what Kurt said, Japan has a culture that black belts is not the mastery; it's the start of the mastery, start of the long road ahead. And like what Darren said that about trophy and black belts, this guy Josh Barnett was given a BJJ black belt for winning a grappling tournament, but he never had any trainings with a BJJ. He was a catch wrestler. So it's like a tournament and a belt. I agree with Darren, and like what Dane said, right? It's should be separate.
Okay. As Seki said, and probably I'm sure other people sensei said as well. When we reached Shodan, he would say, "Now you're ready to start learning the art." And some people,
Sensei, sorry to interrupt you. Exactly what my Japanese teacher said to me.
yeah, and some people, for them, the black belt was the goal, and you never saw them again, and which was really disappointing to Seki. And it's disappointing. I've had black belts that do that. really disappointed me because you as a sensei have put in a ton of work to help this person get where they're at. And they know what your intent was, and that's why it's frustrating. But if they continue, then you know that what you have instilled in them thus far has made an impact. And that gives you as a sensei a sense of accomplishment. And then it's kind of curious to see in what different directions they go and what they learn and what they pick up and how they sometimes challenge your thinking, which is okay with me. And that's another, I'm gonna jot that down for future topic, because we're
My personal experience through the rank infrastructure was when I was a Yankee or purple belt, I felt like I was pretty talented. And then it was a blur through my Q ranks of brown belt. But when I was awarded a Shodan, I thought I was really good. And then immediately I realized that I didn't know anything, but it opened my eyes to everything. And that's where I started to learn. And that's where I started to flourish. And that's where I started to develop. And I did not see any of that prior to. For whatever reason, I didn't recognize that until I achieved that level, until I was awarded that level. And it was like a switch that went off, and it opened my eyes to so many things, to so many avenues, to be able to have a deeper understanding, not only physically be better, but mentally as well. And that's where I started to be able to really and truly learn.
okay.
And you know, every system is different too. Like it can take 12, 15 years to get your black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's okay. But what does that mean where another system might have awarded you your black belt at what I would say the purple belt level of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? It doesn't mean anything. And it goes right back to, it means something to you because you've put so much sweat and tears and blood into it. And Sensei Kirby said it's a proud moment for you as the instructor, like, oh, I actually taught this person something cool. You know, like the biggest compliment I ever got from a fellow police officer is when he came back to me, say that takedown you showed us, I used that last week in the field, and it just happened. And I was like, oh, send me the video. I want to see the body cam. You know, that was like, I actually showed them something that paid off. They were listening, you know. And I guess what I'm getting at is it doesn't really matter how long it, you know, what level of black belt or anything, but it's so hard to project that to society, because everybody is just so goal oriented, which is good. Goals are amazing things to have, but a realistic idea of what it means to get your black belt, and then geez, so, you know, someday we got to be a coral belt or a red belt, depending on your system and what a grandmaster is. And like, I don't think of myself as a master in anything. I'm a jack of all trades. I could never perceive a day where I would have a grandmaster belt around my waist. And
Okay. Anyway, I think we're getting on to 2 hours here. Yeah.
Sensei, before we go any further, I'd like to welcome Ernest Rogers to our conversation. Ernest, we missed you, buddy.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you.
Same
I had some
for-
stuff going on, but I wasn't going to miss it. Yeah.
Same for Ari's. Glad to have you.
Thank Ferraris, yes.
Thank you, Sensei.
I know it's a little later in the day there,
Yeah, it is.
in the Philippines. Anyway, so we're going to meet again the first Saturday in March, and today's discussion was fantastic, and a lot of interaction between you guys, and I really like to see that because we all learn a lot from each other. So next week we're going to be next time we're going to be dealing with restraint techniques. which some of us have had experience with, and we'll get into what is the impact of MMA on self-defense. I think we've actually killed that topic 2 or 3 times or covered it, you know, over the past several weeks, so we may or may not hit that. And why do we train, and core techniques? Anyway, we still have a good list, but if some of you have a topic you'd like to see discussed, let me know. Just send me an email. We'll add it to the list. And I mean, sometimes topics I put down go down the tubes real fast, and other times they, you know, are worthwhile discussion topics. So, you know, please let me know your thoughts, because this is only as good as we all make it. Anyway, hope you have a good weekend. We have President's Day on Monday. Is that way we don't have to remember which president it was we're celebrating? We need to have a national party day. So we don't. Okay. So have a great weekend. We'll see you in early March. Yeah, early March. Okay. So
Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Thank you
Take
very
care.
much.
Bye now.
Appreciate you all.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye.
All right.
Bye-bye.